Hello, New Hope family. This is Pastor Dave coming to you for Sunday, December 27th. It's the last Sunday of the year, and we've just celebrated Christmas on Friday, and we read from Luke chapter 2 on Christmas Eve. And today, I want to look at another part of the Christmas story, a well known incident found in Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 1 through 12. And then I have some questions for you to ponder, and I will help you to find those answers. The message is entitled The Effect of a Faithful Life, Daniel and Jesus. And we're going to be looking at the life of Daniel as it's recorded in the book of Daniel. Kind of a skim through quick reminder of who Daniel was and how he lived during those years of the Babylonian captivity and what came after that, and how his life impacted the future and ended in a witness that brought three wise men from the east to see Jesus at his birth. And so, beginning in Matthew chapter 2, reading from my New King James Bible, it says this: Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, But you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. And so I have three questions I want to lay before you, and then we're going to look at some of the answers. Who were these wise men? Where did they come from? And why did they come? Well, we know they came from the east. The scripture tells us that in this passage that we just looked at in Matthew chapter 2. They had seen a star, something out of the ordinary in the night sky to the west, and it led them to the place where Jesus was born. And there's just a lot of richness and depth in all of this. The treasures that they brought, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Gold, the gift for a king. Frankincense, that special incense that was mainly burned in the holy place of the temple in priestly worship of God. And myrrh, an aromatic, much like frankincense, but different in its uses, one of which was in preparing someone for burial. And we see that with Jesus' burial, as it's recorded in John chapter 19, that Nicodemus brought 100-pound weight of aloes and myrrh, and they wrapped it and interwrapped it with the burial cloths, the strips of cloth that they bound Jesus' body with. And so there was significance in the gifts that they brought. But who were these wise men, and where did they come from, and why did they come? Well, let's look. I want to read a little passage out of my William Barclay commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, on verses 1 and 2 of Matthew chapter 2, talking about these wise men. And here's what it says. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there came to do him homage, wise men from the east. The name given to these men is Magi, and that is a word which is difficult to translate. The Greek historian Herodotus has certain information about the Magi. He says that they were originally a Median tribe. In other words, they were of the Medes. The Medes were part of the empire of the Persians. They tried to overthrow the Persians and substitute the power of the Medes. The attempt failed. From that time, the Magi ceased to have any ambitions for power or prestige and became a tribe of priests. They became in Persia almost exactly what the Levites were in Israel. They became the teachers and instructors of the Persian king. In Persia, no sacrifice could be offered unless one of the Magi was present. They became men of holiness and wisdom. These Magi were men who were skilled in philosophy, medicine, and natural science. They were soothsayers and interpreters of dreams. In later times, the word magus developed a much lower meaning and came to mean little more than a fortune teller, a sorcerer, a magician, or a charlatan. Such was Elymas, the sorcerer recorded in Acts 13, and Simon, who is commonly called Simon Magus. But at their best, the Magi were good and holy men who sought for truth. In those ancient days, everyone believed in astrology. People believed that they could foretell the future from the stars, and they believed that a person's destiny was settled by the star under which he or she was born. It is not difficult to see how that belief arose. The stars pursue their unvarying course. They represent the order of the universe. If then there suddenly appeared some brilliant star, if the unvarying order of the heavens was broken by some special phenomenon, it did look as if God was breaking into his old order and announcing some special thing. We do not know what brilliant star those Magi saw. Many suggestions have been made. About 11 BC, Halley's Comet was visible, shooting brilliantly across the skies. About 7 BC, there was a brilliant conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, and that's exactly what just happened for us on the 21st of December this year. In the years 5 to 2 BC, there was an unusual astronomical phenomenon. In those years, on the first day of the Egyptian month Mesori, Sirius, the dog star, rose. Boy, that's a word. Heliacally, that is, at sunrise. So it came up in the morning when the sun was rising. This was Sirius, the dog star, and it shone with extraordinary brilliance. Now, the name Mesori means the birth of a prince, and to those ancient astrologers, such a star would undoubtedly mean the birth of some great king. We cannot tell what star the Magi saw, but it was their profession to watch the heavens, and some heavenly brilliance spoke to them of the entry of a king into the world. It may seem to us extraordinary that those men should set out from the east to find a king, but the strange thing is that just about the time Jesus was born, there was in the world a strange feeling of expectation of the coming of a king. Even the Roman historians knew about it. And he goes on from there, and I'm gonna stop reading there, but you get a sense of who these magi were. They were Medo-Persian wise men, astronomers, philosophers, keepers of the wisdom of the culture, serving much as it referenced there in Barclay as the role of the Levites who ministered in the temple and helped to offer the sacrifices. So, who they were wise men from that region that had been Babylon and then became conquered by the Medes and the Persians and became Medo Persia. That region was later controlled by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And so that those wise men from generation to generation carried out the duty of preserving the history and the wisdom of the culture in that region. And how was it impacted? Well, why would they come to Judea to see someone like that? Well, let's go to the book of Daniel, if I can get there. Thought I had a marker in there, but apparently I dropped the ball. Oh, no, there it is. And we're just going to kind of skim through some things. But in chapter 1 is where we get the story of Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, being part of the group of young men of prominence in the Judean culture of that day, being taken captive by the forces of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And they are carried away to Babylon. And so we see in this chapter they're relocated and they're being groomed to serve certain functions within the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. He wants to take advantage of their learning. He wants to teach them new things, or have his people teach them new things, different languages, because he wants to integrate them into the system of ruling a vast empire. And these were brilliant and attractive young men who were chosen for those qualities. And so basically, these gentlemen were housed in kind of a collegiate school atmosphere. They were prisoners. They had restrictions, but the food that they were provided came from the king's table, because he wanted them to have the best so that they could be their best and serve him to the best of their abilities. But Daniel and his fellow captives, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, being faithful Hebrew worshipers, did not want to violate the dietary laws of God. And so what we're going to see as we go through this chapter and some following chapters and touch on highlights, we're going to see Daniel, who is the faithful witness. he's faithful to God's laws, including the dietary laws, because it talks about how he talked the keeper that was over them into just giving them vegetables, and the keeper was reluctant to do that. The steward that was in charge of these young men, because he was afraid for his own life if they suffered malnutrition and their appearance suffered, and the king would be aware of that. But God blessed them for their faithfulness. Now, there's been people out there that have come up with a Daniel diet that's just vegetarian, basically. And that's not necessarily the most healthy thing. Um, we need balance. We need proteins in our diet, and there's other sources of getting that. I know I'm not putting down vegetarianism. I'm just saying that sometimes this Daniel diet that they want to push isn't necessarily of itself something that's going to produce the effect that it did as it's recorded here in the book of Daniel. It was a blessing of God for their faithfulness that these men flourished. And so it says in chapter 1, verse 17, well, let's back up to 16. That the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables, because they had been through this 10-day test and they looked better than even the other Hebrews who were in similar situations, who were partaking of the luxurious diet and delicacies of the court. And verse 17 says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. So they were learning foreign languages and the literature of the culture of the Babylonians. So knowledge, skill in literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And so then they're brought before the king at a later time. And as the king grilled them and tested them and examined them, it says in verse 19, then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. So they were elevated because they had honored God in their faithfulness to observe, at least as far as they could, the dietary laws. And it says in verse 20, and in all manners of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he had found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. And thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So God blessed them for their faithfulness. He blessed Daniel above all of them because he was given the ability to interpret visions and dreams beyond the wisdom that the other 3 had. And then we get to chapter 2, and what we see there is Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it troubles him. And he calls in his magi, his Medes, who, well, it says here in verse 2, he gave command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. And the king tells them, I've had this dream. I don't know what it means. You tell me what I dreamed, and you tell me what it means. If you can't, I'm going to kill you all. And they told the king, it's impossible. Unless you tell us what you dreamed, we can't tell you what it means. How do you expect us to know what your dream was? And so the king ordered all of them to be killed. But Daniel, being blessed of God and protected by God, when the officers who had been put in charge of killing all the wise men of the Babylonian Empire, because of this failure and because of the fickleness of King Nebuchadnezzar in demanding this, Daniel said to this captain of the king's guard who was trying to kill them, says, "Why is the decree from the king so harsh?" And so Daniel said, "Let me go before the king and tell him what his dream was and what it means. But I need a little time." And so it says in chapter 2, verse 17, "Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon." And so Daniel had a vision in the night. God blessed him with knowing what the dream was and what it meant. And so interpreting the untold dream was made possible because of his faith in his God. And this dream was this giant image with a head of gold and an upper body of silver and the belly and thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, and the feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Some of you have read through this a lot of times, but basically, what is revealed in this dream is the order of worldly kingdoms from Babylon to Rome, and then to the divided Roman Empire when it became divided by East and West. Because in the 4th century AD, we know that Constantine had become the emperor of Rome. And it was under Constantine that a new capital for the empire was established in Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, Turkey. And so you had someone still in Rome that was kind of a sub ruler under the authority of Constantine, but you had that division, and that's where you see this iron and clay creep in, and that's where the weakness of the Roman Empire became apparent. But in that dream, there was also a miraculous thing, a stone or a rock, not carved out by hands, ended up smashing that image from the feet up. And that stone that destroys the image is Jesus. This dream showed the eventual rulership of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Jesus Christ, as salvation entered the world through him back there in the 1st century AD. And we see that because Daniel was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream and then to interpret its meaning for him, in verse 48, it says, "Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and then chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon." And so here he is promoted to chief administrator over all the wise men of the kingdom. And he's a Hebrew. We get into the later chapters, we see some struggles with Nebuchadnezzar, and he ends up having to admit to the greatness of the God of heaven, the true God, Daniel's God. And in chapters 5 and 6, then, we see the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the rise of the Medes and the Persians. And Daniel, there again, was appointed to a high position because he had this elevated status. And when the Medes and the Persians came in and conquered, they were aware or made aware of this Daniel, this Hebrew, who was an exceptionally wise man. And so in chapter 6, verse 4, we see once again Daniel appointed to a high position. It says, "So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom," because they were jealous of this man. He was one of 3 governors that was appointed over all that they called satraps, which were like district or regional rulers. And he distinguished himself above the governors, and so he was given the supreme position. And so there in verse 4 of chapter 6 of Daniel, these other 2 governors and all the satraps that were under them sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. And that's verse 4. That's how it reads in the King James Version. And what was the problem that they had with Daniel? Well, first off, he was not a Mede or a Persian. He was a Hebrew. He was a foreigner. But the thing that really stung them, these are bureaucrats. And what do bureaucrats do? They take advantage of their position to feather their own nest. We have that same problem in our government today. We see corruption at all levels. We see influence bought and paid for. We see people who start out as fairly ordinary people who serve in our federal government, and when they leave office, they have become millionaires. And, well, how does that happen? How does that happen? Well, there's graft and corruption of all kinds. But what really irritated them about Daniel, who was the chief governor appointed by Darius the Mede, was he had godly integrity. He was not corruptible. He did not participate in the other activities. And so he was the thorn in their side because possibly he was making sure that these other governors, the other 2 of the 3 that had been originally appointed, and all those under them could not get away with their corruption. And so the only thing that they could find fault in him was when they trumped up this idea of tricking the king into issuing an unrevocable edict that he, being the king, was in and of himself to be worshipped as a god, and people for a set time were only to pray to him. Well, you know what happened. Daniel continued faithfully in prayer and worship of the one true God. 3 times a day he could be seen in his upper room through a window praying toward the place the temple had been before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it, to the west from where he was, worshiping the one true God and offering prayer as he worshiped. And so those who broke the king's edict were to be cast into the lion's den. And Daniel was found to be in violation of the king's edict, and he was cast into the lion's den. But did he fear? Well, I don't know about you, but being put in a pit full of hungry lions, I might be a little fearful. But he trusted God. He knew God had a purpose in his life, and he probably knew that God wasn't finished with him yet, because he had been highly exalted and honored and blessed by God for his extreme faithfulness. And so we see his unwavering faith in the one true God in that lion's den incident. The king couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned. He loved Daniel. He trusted Daniel beyond anyone else. And it grieved him that this had come about. And in the morning, what had happened? Daniel was preserved, unscratched, untouched by these ravenous lions. God had literally closed the mouths of the lions and calmed their wild spirits to leave Daniel alone. And he was delivered. So he had godly integrity, he was faithful in prayer and worship, and he had unwavering faith that God would bless him and preserve his life. And the influence that he had is seen throughout this book in the pagan kings who were caused to acknowledge the one true God. Nebuchadnezzar, as you get those incidents where he suffered even mental illness for a time, and it says that he wasn't delivered out of that as he was living like a beast in nakedness and in the wild, in the dew of the morning, and until he looked up and acknowledged the God of heaven. He looked up to heaven and acknowledged him. Then he was delivered out of the madness. So Nebuchadnezzar, his son Belshazzar, had to proclaim that Daniel's God was the true God. Darius the Mede, it's recorded here in the book of Daniel, who acknowledged the God of Daniel as the one true God of heaven. And Cyrus the Persian, who also, during his time of rulership, had to admit that Daniel's God was the one true God. So we see the faithful witness of Daniel. And the blessing in the end of that, as Daniel is seeking what is to come and what is to become of Israel, is found in the very last verse of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 12, verse 13. God, speaking to him, says, "But you go your way till the end." In other words, continue to walk faithfully as long as you live. For you shall rest. And there's that promise of the rest that we have when we step out of this life into the next. And it says, "And will rise to your inheritance at the end of days." And that one verse contains all the blessing and all the truth. As we walk faithfully with God, we are to continue till the end. Christians don't retire from being Christians. We don't reach a retirement goal. Oh, I've led so many people to Christ, or I've done this thing that many years, or whatever. And then you can just sit back and take it easy for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years of your life. You walk faithfully with God to the end, and then you receive the rest, where your spirit departs to be with God and to be at rest from the troubles of the world until the end of days, when you will arise to the inheritance that God has appointed for his faithful saints. So, the point of all this is the effect of a faithful life was a powerful witness to all those who Daniel had encountered throughout his life in Babylon, Medo Persia, right up to the end. And having been positioned over these wise men, and those wise men carrying on the traditions of what they knew and what they had seen and what they had learned from Daniel by the way he lived, by the God he proclaimed. They knew there was a king coming, because some of the prophecy that's in the book of Daniel points to that very thing, the coming of the eternal king. And when that star, that amazing supernatural star, because I don't believe it was an astronomical convergence or anything like that. When you read that passage back in Matthew 2, it sounds like that was specifically something that these astronomy oriented and astrology oriented men would take note of, remembering back to the prophetic words that Daniel had shared, and would follow that extraordinary light to find the eternal King at his birth, and to worship him, to acknowledge his kingship with the gold, to acknowledge his priesthood with the frankincense, and to acknowledge his sacrificial death with the myrrh. A man who lived 600 years before the birth of Christ had that impact through a faithful life. We are called to have similar impact as we walk faithfully in this world. And that's the message for you today. May God bless you in the coming year, and I'll be talking to you soon. Goodbye.